heroes like Daredevil, they are a symptom of the government system not working. The interviews that you're seeing from people, they're asked about Daredevil or Hector as White Tiger. There is a sincere gratitude for the superheroes because they're saying they're actually giving a damn about my everyday life experience.
Vigilantism is not ideal. There's supposed to be this social contract that we all agree to, where us as individual people say, I'm giving up my right to enact violence on the people around me. I'm trusting other people to agree to the same thing. And we're all agreeing that the only entity that's allowed to do that is the state, but the state has to use it lawfully. But when that starts to crumble, that is how things become unsafe. And so now people cannot trust them. I know if something happens to me or someone I care about, there's no one who's going to step in. And therein you have vigilantism, essentially, right? People who are going to now take matters into their own hands because they know the state's not going to. Yeah. Because of that, it leaves this gap. If somebody harms me, I know that the state's not going to step in to protect me because the state does not value me, as we are seeing with Hector Ayala. Crazy Stupid Podcast.
Thank you so much for tuning in. As always, if this is your first time watching, we'd love it if you could hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell so that you are aware of when we post things.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Crazy Stupid Podcast. My name is Esther.
And I'm Adrian.
And today we're here to talk about Daredevil Born Again Episode 4, Sic Semper Systema. I think that's Latin. I don't really know if I said that right.
Probably.
But, I like this episode. I thought this was a strong follow-up to last week.
Yeah.
They're kind of like crystallizing the core message of the show, like with each episode, yes, I think. And I like
agree.
It.
I love that the show is taking its time. We sort of talked about this last week about like the emotional beats of Daredevil, especially episode 3, was something that I hadn't felt in a Disney Plus show in like a really long time. The pacing is also something in Daredevil that I haven't felt in a really long time. Like I remember I was texting one of my in my group chat, it's been a long time since I've been looking forward to a Disney Plus Marvel TV show.
That's a fact.
Maybe Loki or WandaVision.
I mean, I gotta say, I did like Agatha all along.
Agatha was good. I don't know if I was like locked in, ready to watch it, sitting down at 9 p.m. the way that I'm doing with Daredevil. But I think this is just a testament of like, this is what happens when you give it more than just 6 freaking episodes. There's only so much that you could do.
6 is such a wild number.
Yeah, and you more characters get more time to breathe outside of just like 3 main characters.
I also think it's like you don't get an episode like last week's without having this much time, because that was an episode that was more about, you focused a lot of time actually on a character that was not the main character and how that his story impacted your main character. It wasn't necessarily about a lot of things happening to move the plot. It was more about developing the character and the world that you're in. And you don't get time. You don't get to spend time there when you have so much of just a plot narrative to get through in only 6 episodes.
Yeah. This is something that I have really loved about Daredevil Born Again. This show is not necessarily like a Daredevil TV show. This is a story about New York City.
Yeah.
And that I find very refreshing. I remember when the actors Charlie Cox and Vincent D'Onofrio were doing interviews about like, what's the point of having these characters come back? There has to be a story worth telling. And this is such a good decision that they're making, because we haven't seen Matt Murdock in the Daredevil costume since episode 1. In the very first scene, he hasn't been in it since. And they've been spending so much time focusing on the street interviews that are happening with people in New York City, angle shots and video clips of people recording different parts of New York City and bridges and bodegas and people walking. Like you're tapping into the soul of New York City. I think they're doing a really good job of distinguishing what Wilson Fisk is trying to enforce here versus what the people in New York City actually want. The way that they're telling the story is that heroes like Daredevil or Punisher or even White Tiger, they are a symptom of the system, the government system not working for them, regular, ordinary people.
Yeah, I agree. I also think it allows them to get across the messaging that they want to get across a lot more clearly. I was also thinking the same thing about how the conversation that they're having about vigilantism relates to the larger conversation that they're kind of having about crime and justice. A lot of the messaging in the show is not being delivered through Matt Murdock.
No.
Most of it is being delivered through these other characters that he's interacting with. I think the opening of this episode was very impactful because it took me back to when we were having more, we are still having the conversations, but when we were having more prominent conversations about police brutality.
Yes.
The helplessness that Hector Ayala's niece was experiencing and the knowing that there would not be any justice for her uncle because his death was likely the police who were responsible or somebody very adjacent to them. I remember that feeling.
Yeah.
Like I remember when you would be watching the news and you would be seeing the headlines and you would know immediately nothing is going to happen to the people who did this to this person. We're going to be out there in the streets. We're going to be marching, screaming and hollering about this. And at the end of the day, they're going to get away with it. And what Matt was saying to her was, he wasn't saying we will get the person who did this. He was saying you have to believe that we will get the person who did this, which are two very different things. It's the difference between saying I genuinely believe in the system that it will do what it's supposed to do and saying you have to keep believing in the system because what is the alternative?
Yeah. And I think that's what Hector's niece was kind of trying to get at. She's got all of this rage and it's like who is she supposed to turn to for support? Because the city's not going to back regular New Yorkers. The city's going to back the police.
Yeah.
There were people who had limited interactions with police officers and they couldn't understand this idea of wanting to like abolish police. Like that was something that came around, or defunding the police. And regardless of where people sort of landed at that conversation now, like I know that you and I have sort of processed what that could potentially look like and what safety looks like. What led them to that point of taking a very staunch stance on this was something that people were unwilling to sit with. And that frustration of no one's listening to the pain that I'm expressing right now was something that I felt like Hector's niece she portrayed that and displayed that so well.
I actually really hope we see more of her character. I thought that I really enjoyed seeing her on screen.
Well, Matt gave her the rest of Hector's stuff with the white tiger cloth and the necklace in it. So I'm assuming, and somebody in our comment section pointed that out.
Yeah.
So now I'm wondering if this is how the mantle get passed, because in the comics, the current white tiger is a Puerto Rican woman.
I really want to talk about this conversation that the lawyer that was prosecuting Leroy Bradford and that what the conversation she has with Matt, where she talks about this idea of deterrence. Basically what she says is like, the whole point of deterrence is that, the sentences for your crimes increase, right? Not that they go down. Then she says, and it works, right? Implying like this is a effective way of deterring crime. There is so much hypocrisy within the justice system that this show is pointing out. The actual issue is someplace else, right? It's about resources, which is what Bradford brings up when he's talking to Matt, which I have to say that was so well done, because I'm not going to lie. When Matt went back to him with the 10 days, I was like, yeah,
bro,
good.
You're bugging.
And then when he was like, you want me to thank you for that? I was like, well, yeah, sir. But when he started talking, I was like, yeah, you are absolutely right, because it is so cyclical. The system does not have any interest in actually preventing these types of crimes, because we actually know what does it. It's not a mystery. We know the types of policies that need to be in place in order to actually deter specifically crimes against property, theft, nonviolent offenses. We know what has to be done in order to do those. And like he was saying, they're not interested in doing that, even though it costs less. We have these ideas about what is and is not worth protecting, and basically the state has decided that property is what is worth protecting. Yeah. Because then the thing that's so hypocritical is that on the flip side of this, you have this conversation about the fact that a life was lost. And like Matt says, nobody cares. Either it was the police, which, I mean, to be fair, we don't know. But even if it wasn't the police are not stepping in with any sort of urgency to figure out who did do it. Yeah. Even the casing for the gun, the guy's like, what can I say? Like,
if it's not here, it's not my problem.
Which again just goes to show like what is actually valued by our justice system and what is actually protected.
I think Daredevil is doing such a good job about answering the question, what does it mean to feel safe in your city. And I think they're doing a really good job of showing that what the people in New York City are asking for is very different than the solutions that Wilson Fisk is bringing forth. You're seeing murals of White Tiger all across New York City. The show is doing a very intentional job of showing you that. It's supposed to be important. The interviews that you're seeing from people, regular people in New York City, when they're asked about Daredevil or Hector Ra's White Tiger or even Spider-Man. I mean, some in ways how they talk about Punisher, maybe. But there is a sincere gratefulness and gratitude for the superheroes because they're saying they're actually giving a damn about my everyday life experience. They're not just like putting me through the system, this bureaucratic system that feels very apathetic to what I'm going through. And that is a direct contrast to the messaging that Wilson Fisk is pushing out. And essentially, Fisk is saying, this is what you need in order to feel safe. But that's not what the people in New York City are actually saying. This is going to feel like a tangent, but I am from the state of New York. And so New York politics across the entire state is something even though I'm in DC, I keep in touch with. Mm-hmm. But Merrick Adams, he goes on the Breakfast Club. He essentially is getting grilled by a number of people in that interview. Good. He kind of comes with this idea of like the people of New York City, it's across the board. The data is telling them they don't feel safe. And his response is over policing in the neighborhoods. It's over policing in the subway, in the metro system. And I can't remember what her name was, but I ended up following her on all of her social media platforms because she made such a great point where she was saying, you're looking at the data and your assumption is to create almost like a militarized state in your city. But when they're saying what the people in New York are saying, what they need to feel safe, that's not what they mean. They start listing some of the things and some of the examples that this show brought up about what it means to feel content and safe in the city, like them reverting back into superheroes as opposed to police officers. I think it was an intentional choice that Daredevil is making. And it was like Eric Adams couldn't understand a world where the idea of safety is not an overblown budget for policing, but rather other resources and accommodations in addition to policing. Like he couldn't understand the data and assumed an oversimplified reason for it.
Yeah.
And that I felt like Daredevil's doing such a good job of portraying that. Like they're not on the verge of, and this is not like a judgment call, but they're not on the verge of like abolishing or defunding the police. They're just simply saying police alone are insufficient, which is why we've come to appreciate vigilantes and superheroes.
That's such a good point about Eric Adams looking at the data and assuming that like safety equals police.
Yeah.
It reminds me when I was reading that book, Ghetto Side.
I was going to bring that up. It reminded me of it. Yeah.
One of the phrases that she says, because she kind of has to go through this whole spiel to kind of like justify the premise of the book, because the premise of the book is to talk about how like in like low income, specifically Black communities, the homicide rate specifically is disproportional. It's like disproportionate. It's like disproportionately high compared to other communities, right? And she's essentially trying to offer an explanation for this that doesn't rely on this idea of Black criminality and all this stuff. But one of the things that she talks about is it's like, it's kind of hard to talk about this issue because it like can lead itself to this idea of like, well, then we need to have more cops in these places,
Yeah.
and it just gets in this whole thing. But one of the things that she said is that places where there are many Black people and people who are lower income are over policed, but they are under protected. And so there's a high presence of police, but the police there are not functioning to actually protect them. And I feel like the reason why I don't know. He was a cop, Eric Adams. Okay, so I feel like the reason why someone like Eric Adams, but also I think a lot of people who live in suburbia, the reason why they cannot understand this disconnect between people wanting to feel safe but people not liking police is because when you're in a city where there is a lot of crime, you are daily met with the realities of who you're. First of all, you're in communication and contact with police just more often, right? Like if you live in suburbia, you really don't see or talk to cops that much. And because of that, you are daily seeing the purpose that they actually serve and what they're actually there to protect and what they're actually not there to protect. And one of the ideas that is discussed in this book, Ghetto Side, is this idea that one of the biggest ways to deter crime, pretty much the only way that to deter crime that police can do, right? Like there's a bunch of other things that have to happen, the resources being the main thing. But when it comes to violent crime, the biggest thing that they can do is step in and hold people accountable when they harm somebody else. But what happens in communities like New York City and other communities across the country where there are Black people and poor people is that when those people are harmed, the state does not find who did it. It doesn't go, all the things that need to fall into place and that type of urgency that needs to happen in order to figure out who did this, it doesn't happen. As we are seeing with Hector Ayala, they're not going into overdrive to figure out who unalived him. And so because of that, it leaves this gap. If somebody harms me, I know that the state's not going to step in to protect me because the state does not value me. In my community, the state values property and it values material capital. If I do something against those things, something might happen to me. But harm against my fellow man in this place does not matter to them. I know if something happens to me or someone I care about, there's no one who's going to step in. And therein you have vigilantism, essentially, right? People who are going to now take matters into their own hands because they know the state's not going to. And they also know, like, if I'm going to do something, or if, like, a bad actor who decides to harm somebody without reason also has this assurance that, like, well, the state doesn't actually really care. So they probably will not find out who did it.
That's why you get things like Black Panther parties, right? They understood that, like, our communities, due to obviously a number of reasons, mainly being racism, kicks in and the state isn't protecting us. So we're creating our own means of protection, our own means of safety, our own means of survival, essentially. And they were villainized very intentionally, very systematically. And that just kind of reminds me of the conversation that we're having here, is that whenever efforts are made by regular people to protect themselves and having a nuanced look at it, like it's not a black or white thing, there is no nuance in the way that the state portrays it. They immediately portray them as inherently and holistically evil or corrupt or wrong.
I'm not a major fan of vigilantism personally, like in the real world. That's not my preferred.
Dang, so you're not on the free Luigi wave? Oh, man.
Don't say that. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is I feel like vigilantism is not ideal. Like living in a world where people feel the need to take matters into their hands is not ideal. And it does create a sense of chaos and like a lack of safety, right? Like there is supposed to be this like contract that we all, this is also in the book, there's supposed to be this social contract that we all agree to, wherein you basically us as individual people say, okay, I'm giving up my right to enact violence on the people around me, and I'm trusting other people to agree to the same thing, that they will not enact violence as well. And we're all agreeing that the only entity that's allowed to do that is the state, but the state has to use it lawfully, right? A lawful use of violence is allowed by the state, and we all agree to that. And that's by and large how communities stay safe. But when that starts to crumble, that is how things become unsafe. It crumbles because the state is using their right to enact violence on people outside of the law. And so now people cannot trust them. And it also happens, well, and then honestly, as a result of that, you start to have things like this, right? Like the contract is broken and it does make things unsafe. So like ideally, the ideal world would not require vigilantism. It wouldn't require people to step outside of the law to handle things like this. But it is frustrating that the conversation about the solutions is never about the lack of trust. It's never about, because that's what it is. It's like people are losing faith in a system that is broken, and they know and see that the system does not care about them and is not trying to actually protect them from anything. So what do? But like Eric Adams' idea of just like throwing in a bunch of cops, that does not solve that. They don't trust the cops, and rightfully so. So like, what do you think that's going to do? It's like, I'm not like pro vigilantes, but it's just like, why are they there? I don't know. Let's start asking some more meaningful questions. This is like a brief thing. I did appreciate it was a negative interaction, but I appreciate them showing the interaction that Matt Murdock has with Leroy Bradford when Bradford's like, my blind lawyer, what are you gonna do? You can't see, making all these ableist jokes. Essentially, I don't think people always think of Daredevil as like a disabled hero and like a hero that provides representation for the disabled community. I think one of the reasons why they don't do that is because a lot of the emphasis on him being blind is about how exceptional he is, even though he's blind. Like he can fight and he has super hearing, and you know, it doesn't hinder him, and he's able to like do all of these things. And so you don't really have the conversation about the fact that like, but he is a person with a disability. Having this moment where they show him experiencing ableism, I think is important. It's like an important reminder that like, yes, he has all these super abilities and he is able to do things that people with sight cannot do, right? That does not mean though that he is not a disabled person who faces the same biases and the same challenges that people in the disability community experience.
With constant microaggressions.
Yes. And so I just thought like it was good for them to include that.
Yeah. And I mean, I would also say, I think this is why the way that the Netflix Daredevil handled his mentor Stick, I thought was perfect, because I mean, being in the DEI space that I work in, these sort of self-advocacy and self-determination for people with disabilities is like one of the first things that they're taught, whether it's in college or whether it's in like the K through 12 space, right? You're going to have to do things on your own. And that is emphasized in the disabled community, I would argue, more than in other spaces. Stick, I think, does a really good job of instilling that in Matthew. Now, obviously, he goes a little bit overboard, but it's the idea of at some point, you're going to have to find a way to navigate through that in a way where you can essentially find ways to take care of yourself. That was like another theme that I think they brought up that I think was important. One thing that I wanted to talk on was the argument that Frank Castle has with Matt.
Good stuff, that.
We got ourselves another, not even fight, bro, just ideological battle with Frank and Matt. This scene with Frank Castle and Daredevil is so important because it's a direct tie-in to the argument that they had on the rooftop in season 2 of Daredevil. There's a line that Frank says where he was like, you know, the funny thing about the difference between you and me is that you're just one bad day away from being just like me. And that's exactly what Daredevil goes through in episode 1 of this season. What happens with Foggy, Matt loses his cool and he breaks his code. And that code was the only difference between what Daredevil does versus what the Punisher does. Matt does not unalive people. And this was this moment, and I remember you brought this up earlier in the season when we were reviewing it, of like the code and the nuance of humanity. Like, is Matt Murdock even still fully believing in that and those things being blurred? And I think Punisher was kind of tapping into that. Frank was trying to challenge Matt to say, like, when that thing happened with Foggy, something changed in you that you're unwilling to sit with and grapple and wrestle. I think it sort of shows as to why Matt is like even more overly devoted to the legal system, because I think he's afraid of what losing Foggy did to him. Something changed in him. And if he accepts that, I don't think he's able to live with this new version of who he is.
Yeah, that was a really interesting conversation. I'm starting to reach a point where I feel like Matt putting the mask back on actually is like a character regression.
Oh, yeah. I can see that, yeah.
Because I understand the tension and I understand what Frank was trying to get him to see. There's definitely some denial and some avoidance, and there are things that Matt has not quite worked through yet. I think it was less about his guilt for trying to unalive Bullseye, and I think it was more about his guilt for not being able to save and avenge Foggy. And I think that is different. And I definitely think that he still needs to work through that a little bit. But I think that the arguments that he made with Frank were right.
Yeah.
I think what he was saying was right and was true. And it feels like a full acceptance of that is where he should land. It's true. Like, the man got life in prison. That is the best case scenario within the code of ethics that he has created for himself. I am curious how they're going to handle his decision to put the mask back on and start taking things outside of the law, because while it's true that he's definitely trying really hard to convince himself and convince other people that he can work within the system, he's also working within the system to try to make it work.
Yeah.
And I think that that's a worthwhile effort. And I think it's better.
Yeah, especially than what Frank is doing.
Better than what Frank is doing. But I also think better than putting back on the mask and being Daredevil again, personally. So I'm kind of interested to see how they're going to handle him making that decision. I also think it's going to get at some really interesting questions around like what does justice actually look like? And especially what does justice look like when a life has been lost? Because you have to get into these questions of who decides who gets to live or die, and why do they get to make that decision. This is the conversation we have about capital punishment. It's the same thing of like, if somebody does something bad enough, then does the state now get to decide who lives and who doesn't? If they made that decision for somebody else, if they decided if another person gets to live or not, does that now justify us doing the same thing and making that decision for them? Personally, I've landed on the side of no, it doesn't. That's kind of the core of this question. And honestly, for a lot of people, what answers that question is religion. I trust that when our systems here on earth fail, because in a situation where somebody is unalived, there is not any way on this earth for justice to actually be served, right? Something so horrible was done. There's nothing that can make it right. But you choose to entrust that into something greater than yourself.
Yeah.
And I think that's kind of where Matt was before all of this. But again, as we've seen, he ain't been to a church. He ain't talked to the Lord.
Okay, Matt, he hasn't been at church. He hasn't done a confession. He hasn't visited a father. He hasn't even stepped foot in a sanctuary.
He's missing that piece. And I think that was the piece that made it all click for him.
Yes.
And I think that's the piece that makes it all click for a lot of people. Whether your religion is Christianity or it's Islam or it's Judaism or Buddhism or whatever, most faith systems have an idea about justice, divine justice, and what it means when you have to take things out of your own hands and allow a greater power and a greater being to take care of it and trust that they will. And if you're a person who's been reliant on that and you no longer have that, now you're going to feel very shaky about what are the limits that you put on yourself. And I think that's the place that he's in. But again, I don't know what it looks like for him to accept that and then put the mask back on. And then I think there's like a lot of complex things that they got to work through to make that make sense.
And I need to know where's going to be the checks and balances for him, because when he was wrestling with things, he went to Foggy. He went to the father, the Catholic Church. And now, like I've been saying, now that those are gone, what's going to stop him from going over the edge? Again, Wilson Fisk's relationship with Vanessa is very interesting. A couple of things when the therapist asked Vanessa, like, what drew you into this quote unquote Adam character? She says his hands. Now that is important because there has been a very over-intentional effort to focus on Wilson Fisk's hands this season. The directors and showrunners are very intentional about that because of the sort of like the tics that he has, some sort of, disability that he's sort of carrying, right? But also with Fisk, there had been emphasis on like him not being that bigger person was an intentional choice, right? Because he's slimmed down, he's trying to fit a mold to be more like mayor-like, essentially, right? And so like he's barely eating things like an omelet and like a couple of like veggies on his plate. But at the end of this episode, when he's with Adam, there's a full plate of food in that basement. That's why they were
showing us the food.
Yes.
I didn't notice that juxtaposition.
And so the same way you would say that there might be a regression on Matt's part to put back on that mask to be Daredevil, Fisk eating all that food is a regression to being more like Kingpin. And so that I thought was very good writing there for his character.
We've also been seeing his Kingpin mentality start to bleed over into the whole Mayor Fisk thing.
The facade is fading.
Yeah. One of the things I was like, I don't think that he has the emotional wherewithal for this position.
Nah, he's over and over his head. I don't think
he's got that. He doesn't have the emotional regulation necessary for such a high pressure role, and everybody around him should be very afraid.
Yeah.
Because he already slipped up once by threatening to unalive that guy.
I mean, we saw the bruises on his knuckles. That's got to be directly related to Adam. So how long has he been holding up this facade? Because essentially we had hopes that like there had been a shift, but maybe very similar to Daredevil, maybe things were tampered.
I also think because, you know, after that diner episode, I kind of had this impression that Fisk had kind of worked through a lot of things that Matt was still working through.
Yeah.
But after seeing this episode, I think what I'm realizing is just because Fisk is able to verbalize these things that make it seem like he has come to a place of emotional maturity, his actions in no way back that up, right? I think what actually puts Matt Murdock in a better place than Fisk is the fact that he's wrestling with it in real time. It looks like he doesn't have things figured out, and he doesn't, but the fact that he's working through it and trying to figure it out and trying different things, less violent things, the fact that he's trying to change his pattern of behavior is what makes it so that he is in actually a better place in terms of his healing than Fisk, even though it looks messier on the outside.
Yeah. Anyways, y'all, those are our thoughts. We'd love to hear what you all think about this episode. So let us know in the comments below. Again, like we say every week, we really appreciate the support that you guys have provided for us and the conversations and dialogue that you've created in our comment section. So we love for you to continue that. And with that, we will see you all next week. Take care, everyone. Peace.